Mi nombre es Virginia González y junto con Alesia, Ana Carolina, ICCROM, PACHAMAMA y ASINPPAC les damos la bienvenida a este seminario de 3 días que se desarrollará online de manera internacional porque tenemos gente de todo el mundo, así que estamos súper contentos y contentas de tenerlas aquí como parte de este evento. En principio vamos a hablar, les pedimos por favor, vamos a grabar las sesiones y esto después se va a subir tanto en Pachamama como en ASINPPAC de manera posterior. Estos 3 días se van a desarrollar durante 3 horas. Debajo del diálogo aquí en la sala van a tener 2 opciones de interpretación, así que ustedes pueden elegir escucharlo en español o escucharlo en inglés. Lo que les pedimos, por favor, es que apaguen sus cámaras y sus micrófonos, así la grabación sale bien. Cualquier pregunta o duda que tengan, por favor, escríbanlas en el chat y poco a poco las vamos a ir respondiendo. Por otro lado, bueno, aquí está Ana Carolina, que es parte de nuestra... estamos trabajando en conjunto, tanto ASINPPAC como Pachamama, así que Ana Carolina, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí, por ser parte de este proyecto. La verdad que fue muy interesante poder trabajar juntas y esperemos poder seguir trabajando, claro que sí. Y vamos a hacerla en 2 minutos. Alesia, si estás por ahí y si te parece, podemos arrancar con la presentación. Ella es Alesia Strozzi, ella va a dar la primer charla. Pero bueno, primeramente vamos a empezar a presentar el desarrollo de estas jornadas. En principio queríamos comentarles que quienes organizan en conjunto este seminario es el ICCROM, quien representa el ICCROM es Alesia en este caso, que está aquí con nosotros, pero bueno, es un equipo detrás que es mucho más grande. ASINPPAC, que en este caso lo estoy representando yo, pero por supuesto nuestro grupo de colegas está trabajando detrás, tanto socios como la gente de la comisión directiva, y por otro lado, el Instituto de Conservación y Restauro Pachamama, que en este caso está representado por nuestra querida Ana Carolina, que está aquí con nosotros. Por supuesto, el apoyo de Sancor Seguros, que está representado hoy por César Abatida, que hablará también en una de estas jornadas de este seminario. El Museo Sarmiento, que va a ser parte y ha sido parte de este proyecto, todo esto comienza a partir de una capacitación, a partir del ICCROM, de manera online, que se da el College Asia Team, donde se realizaron un montón de trabajos continuos y capacitaciones, y a partir de eso surgió poder llevar este evento, o traerlo, mejor dicho, aquí a Argentina y a Brasil, y por supuesto a todos los países de Latinoamérica. Quiero agradecer enormemente el trabajo de Yui Ambani, que ha sido, la verdad, de mucho soporte para nosotros, porque es quien nos ha ayudado con la organización del Zoom y demás, a Constanza Ludeña, a Gedaya Garaibé, a Ignacio Legari, a Alesia Strozzi, por supuesto, y a Ana Carolina Delgado Vieira, que hoy están con nosotras aquí, que han trabajado muchísimo para que esto pueda llevarse adelante. Por supuesto, todas estas 3 jornadas van a ser interpretadas inglés-español, español-inglés, así que les agradecemos enormemente la colaboración de Anelei Lacalle, Laura Sangronis, Karen Hirschfeld, perdón chicas la mala pronunciación, Ana Carolina Ferro, Diana Crimi y Aldana Fresca, que van a estar con nosotros estas 3 jornadas, y por supuesto agradecer enormemente a Sancor Seguros, que ha podido colaborar para que las chicas hoy puedan estar con nosotros haciendo esta interpretación, que por supuesto el costo de esta interpretación ha sido muy bajo por la colaboración, en realidad lo hacen por colaboración a ASINPPAC, a Pachamama y a ICCROM, así que les agradecemos enormemente. Bueno, entonces, Alesia, te doy la palabra.
Buenos días. Well, I do not really speak a lot of Spanish, and so I'll move direct to English. And I'm really thankful to Virginia and Anna Carolina for the willingness of being here today. So without further ado, let's then start with the presentation. Can you see my screen?
Sí. Yes.
Oh, okay, perfect. So let me then start. So as I was saying, I really want to congratulate Virginia and Anna Carolina and the ASINPPAC Associated, also the Instituto de Restauración, for the willingness to share the knowledge acquired through the ICCROM FAR College International course on rethinking disease management for cultural heritage collections. And also to thank all of you that you are decide to attend this seminar, for being here today and the upcoming days to work together and to spread the knowledge that we are going to share. As Virginia was saying, the aim of this seminar is to raise awareness on the topic of disaster and risk management, and to share the main concepts which belong to this subject, such as risk, hazards, and so on. To achieve these goals, we need to use the same dictionary in order to understand each other. And later on, I will also move a little bit on what is a disaster risk management plan. But this is part of a general overview of the entire seminar, let's say. So, as I was saying, we need to talk not the same language, because this is an example where we do not speak the same language, but we need to have the same dictionary. We need to give the same meaning, the same words. And so let's now start from the title of the seminar, and let's focus on the first part, disaster risk management. Management is the ability to deal with, and our focus will be managing disaster risk. There will be a presentation dedicated to risk, so I will not focus on this. My focus is on the word disaster. This is an example of a picture that actually is I've expressly choose for you, because it's something that is touching you personally. It's the fire on the National Museum of Brazil. And when we see this, what we think, what we come up in our mind, is that what is a catastrophe. It's an emergency. It's a disaster. Indeed, it is. But what is really important, that we need to use a common use of term. It is relevant to this seminar, and also when we work, to use the appropriate term in order to understand not only each other as heritage professionals, but also with those professionals who deal with disaster daily, the one that work as a primary resource on disasters. Because those terms are used every day as the same meaning, but actually when you work in a disaster, they have a particular meaning, each of them. We now focus on the word disaster again. And I'm really going to go detail and read this. Disaster, as stated by the United Nations Officer for Disaster Risk Reduction, can be defined as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, and economic or environmental losses and impacts, which exceed the ability of the affected community or society to cope with using its own resources. And I want to stress again this, which exceed the ability of the affected community or society to cope with using its own resources. So this is the big difference when we talk about disaster. It's that is going to affect the community. While with the emergency is sometimes used interchangeably with the term disaster, as for example, in the context of biological and technological hazards, and this is another word that you're going to see later on, or as emergencies, which, however, can also relate to hazards events that do not result in the serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society. Okay, I think we can summarize in this way. Emergency is related to one building. So it's just the one. It can be, I hope not, your house, if there is a water leakage or something. It is confined and the community around, it's not particularly affected. I have no doubt that for entire nation, also from a psychology point of view, the fire on the National Museum of Brazil has been a huge, not only an emergency itself, but had been a greater impact. But when we use the word, we can say that has been a huge fire emergency, because the people were eventually, like us, we were psychology affected. But correct me if I'm wrong, no one from the community around has lost a house or has lost something, really has lost the museum, the value of the museum, which has no doubt, but the effect, it didn't spread. While disaster they have this particular wider spread effect that is going to affect the entire community or that area. One example, always on fire, can be the Kobe city in Japan in 1995. After a huge earthquake, the secondary hazard, the fire, burned to ashes the entire city. And this is, I want to also show because I just focus on, for our own seminar, on the word disaster. Let me know if you can still see what going. Can you see also the other screen?
No.
Can you see the website?
No, Alessia.
Oh, sorry. Then let me do this. I thought I was sharing this. So what I want to show you is the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office, which is dedicated to the disaster risk reduction, which is a theme that you're going to have in a later on presentation. What I want to share with you, which I think is really important, is the terminology, which is a dictionary, where you can see all the words that have been used in this field of disaster risk management, in order for all of us, just exposure, early awareness system. So it's a resource, an easy resource that you can later on follow. And as you can see here in disaster, I have taken the definition from here, and there is a definition of emergency. And what I want to stress is that for the scope and dive framework, in order for all of us to understand what we are talking about, we have different, the disaster also is getting in more detail, like small scale disaster, large scale disaster. So, but what is really important is that the local community is affected. Okay, this is what I want to share. Let me now share again the PowerPoint. So here we are. Can you see, right?
Yes.
Okay. And now let's focus on the second part of the title, which is scenario-based training. What do we mean with this? Training, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is the process of learning the skill that you need to do a job. How then can we achieve to reach the goal to understand disaster risk management? Through the scenario. Scenario is a realistic story, or the most realistic one, of what can happen in case of a disaster. It is based on a previous assessment of the value for your collection, building, site, your cultural institution. I'm going to use the word cultural institution so I'm going to compromise. I'm going to use it so I don't have all the time to say building, collection, theater. You know, it's a bigger word that can collect all the others. So, and how the value, so is based on the previous assessment. So the scenario is based on the previous assessment of the value of your cultural institution and the value, how it is distributed in your building or site. And is based on the assessment of the risk of your institution. So, and basically it's a story. So during the seminar, you're going to have the presentation on the significance of the value, which is the presentation you're going to follow, the concept of risk and its components, and you will see these components, how they unfolded, and presentation by presentation, how they are related to build, how they are related in the scenario, and how you can use to build the scenario. We will start today with the Museo Histórico Sarmiento, later on with the presentation of Virginia, and then tomorrow you have the presentation of real scenarios of disaster and emergency, which have unfortunately occurred, but from which we must learn. These events may occur also to our museum and to our cultural institution. But if we know how the risk can unfold, we can work to reduce the loss. We need to be proactive, and of course, not everything is our hands, but if there is one little thing that we can do, it's really time to do. Also, the climate crisis is definitely something that there's no doubt any longer. So we are going to see more and more disaster around us, unfortunately. We will use this concept to write the procedure of the disaster risk management plan. And now let's go into detail. What is a disaster risk management plan? What I want to that you go, whatever, you go back home, you switch off the computer and say, okay, this is a disaster risk management plan. It is a process. This is really important. It's I'm going really to repeat and repeat. It is a process. When you write the procedures, assign a role and responsibilities, and once you have written or done, it's you cannot feel comfortable on having achieved the task, done, now we are happy and safe. We need to make sure that our colleagues are participating, and we need to share this knowledge, and we need also to repeat the disaster risk management plan, make simulation, okay? It cannot stay in the drawer, but it should be revised and tested at least once per year. Doing so, we will move from being just, you know, as a passive to be proactive and active, and we will know how to react. Because we need to move from what we are now today, that we are our heritage professional, we are really beautiful in our diversities, in our different skills and capacities, but in case of disasters, we need to understand how the disaster professional work, and we need to switch, really, and I'll move, we need to switch our normal day to understand this is a disaster, we need to move, we need to behave in a different way. And who knows, we need to know what we do, what to do, how the roles and responsibility have been previously assigned, and everyone, really everyone part of the museum, the cultural institution, should know the procedure. We need to learn from the disaster professionals, as said. This is just some pictures to show that it is possible to collect all your colleagues and put them in a 2-hour simulation. These are part of a ICCROM course where we are learning what to do, and later on we move back to our own museum, our own cultural institution, and we share the knowledge as Virginia and is doing today with you. And we need to also to understand that we need to make drills on like we make normal evacuation drills, to learn out where is the, in case of fire, the nearest evacuation route, or in case of an earthquake, how we can protect ourselves. To stress the importance of the process to this concept, I just use, let me quote the Eisenhower: plans are nothing, planning is everything. Because during the planning, you are going to learn, you're going to test, you're going to prove, and you're going to share what are the procedure. Because if you just write down, like most of us museum, they do have the emergency plan, they have the disaster plan, but they are in a drawer. And there, in case of something happen, they are useless, okay? We need to learn. We need to learn how they are, where they are. We need to also to share, also having in a cloud sources, and this is how we can better react. Because really a benefit of a disaster risk management plan, it's going to have a less chaotic response. You are going to be ready for the emergency and disasters, so you are going to save time, and time is really crucial. You know how much time can affect our objects, our cultural heritage. We then can improve the salvage efforts, improve the recovery, so we shorten the time needed to bounce back. And the other immediate impacts are that we can identify the preservation priorities, we update the contact information, and we reduce the cost of bouncing back. The disaster, and I want just to be sure that it's clear, the disaster risk management plan is a process. So we could even say that is a disaster risk management planning, which requires us to understand also how the civil protection works and how, once the humanitarian aspect is over, they might help. This is why we need to also to integrate the disaster risk management plan for cultural heritage into the one of the people, because all of us, basically all of us, it's let's say that in most of our countries, the law obligates, it's mandatory to have evacuation route and or having in place such as reducing the disaster, reducing the impact of the damage. Like, for example, for the fire, we have what's it called? Fire extinguishers, and we have all of this material that is going to reduce the impact of the fire. So instead of doing two different things, it's really relevant to do things together. And this also will make our life easier, because we can start from something that's already there, from something that has a structure, and it's going to make just our life easier, because it means that through the scenario, we can say, oh, it's going, in case there is a fire on our collection, how we are going to save it. What can we do to reduce the impact of the fire on our collection? I'm not saying just, of course, there is the fire extinguisher, but also later on, you will see, better understand during the other presentation. Another plus of planning for a disaster, it's through this example. I think through an example, it makes just easier. If you plan for an emergency, which occurs just in your cultural institution, for example, a water leakage, you know how to respond to that specific case. But in case of a disaster occur, you are not prepared. You know, you see there's no hat on it, you know. But if you prepare yourself for a disaster, if you plan for a disaster, you are going also to be able to respond also for your own emergency, because you're going to use the disaster plan also for the emergency. The disaster plan allows you to understand how the system of the civil protection works. So how the disaster professional around yourself work, and allows you to know the stakeholders involved and the actors involved, and eventually you can also getting to know them and also understand to whom request help in case of needing, which gives you huge help in the midst of a chaos, because a disaster is first and foremost is a moment of really chaos because of the huge impact that is going to affect the community. So the community doesn't have any guide, so I need to cope with this. I would like just to say a few words on the preventive conservation. In the preventive conservation field, it also used the term risk, vulnerability, exposure, which is really good because it's going to help us to understand those concepts, but we need to make a distinction. Not all of these 10 agents of deterioration will cause a disaster. Only few of them, we can say, fire if it's going to spread disaster in all the city, water if it's a flood. But for example, incorrect humidity will not make a disaster. And I kindly ask you to keep in mind this, because actually those are really relevant. Later on, you will understand about the vulnerabilities that are connected. Preventive conservation is important. It's another field. We need to make distinction of it because, you know, also the incorrect temperature is going to not make a disaster. But those things are our vulnerabilities, okay, that are going to increase the amount of risk. And later on, you will see in detail. I will just to finish with the last sharing, which is, I think, is really important. Well, los desastres no son naturales. There are no natural disasters. Disasters have human origins. You will find in the literature natural and man-made disaster, but hazards are natural, such as earthquake, volcanic eruption, floods. So hazards are natural hazards. Disasters are not natural. Those hazards, such as earthquake, floods, volcanic eruptions, they have the right to be here. They are part of our world. They have shaped our world. And just to understand this, we need to switch, and we need to change to use the word natural disasters, because when we understand that disasters are not naturals, it means that we take responsibility on what we do. As just an example, if an earthquake occurs in a desert and no one is injured, it is simply an event. If these earthquakes occur in a city where people and things are injured or damaged, we will call it a disaster. So if we think to Chile, for example, we know that there are very strict building code, and for this reason, earthquakes do not cause damages. So it's a part of our responsibility to understand where we are, which are our hazards, and how can we deal with it. Having said this, I thank you all for your attention, and I hope it was clear. If you have a question, please do so. And I think we are really ready and warm up for the next presentation. Over to Virginia. Thank you.
Oh, gracias, Alesia. Alesia, yo pensando que ibas a hacer la mitad y hablar primero de determinadas cosas y después de tu ponencia, no te presenté correctamente. Así que lo voy a hacer ahora, porque corresponde que te presente. Así que antes que nada quería presentarles a Alesia. Alesia es mentora y profesora de este programa, Far Collegia from ICCROM, y como responsable de conservación del Ministerio de Cultura italiano, también es responsable del área de educación e investigación. Antes de ello, ella trabajó como consultora en el ICCROM para proyectos, por ejemplo, de libros antiguos y la Biblioteca Gersitiana del Instituto Max Planck en Roma. Además, es máster en conservación de papel y de libros y estudió Derecho Internacional Europeo de Desastres. Formó parte de una investigación sobre protección civil italiana en nombre de la Federación Internacional. Además es voluntaria de la Cruz Roja desde el año 2001, donde participó en ejercicios de protección civil y ayudó a personas en emergencia. Y además, en el ámbito de las emergencias, participó en el EQ de Emilia y el EQ de Italia Central en la recuperación del patrimonio cultural afectado. Así que, bueno, al revés, pero muchísimas gracias, Ale. Bueno, y antes de pasar a DePacchi, queríamos sumar, sí, es verdad, aplausos, aunque sea virtual. Queríamos sumar y llevar adelante una mini encuesta que les vamos a hacer ahora. Lo que les vamos a pedir es que bueno, puedan contestarla ahora para tener alguna, digamos, una estadística de qué sucede en cada institución. Les pedimos que por favor contesten dentro de estos, les vamos a dar unos un minuto para que puedan contestar y que nos permita entonces tener una estadística. Eso después lo vamos a compartir, pero bueno, ya que somos de varios lugares y varias instituciones, nos serviría poder tener estos datos. Así que nos quedan 30 segundos, tienen que contestar todas si es posible, y luego de eso les mostramos los resultados. Solo 15 segundos más. Muy bien. Espero que
can
hayan
use this.
Sí, Alesia.
I don't know if you want to give some minutes more.
Ok, perfecto. Todavía siguen contentando.
Yeah, I know that there is just a question from Ortigosa Walter. What happened Notre Dame of Paris? This was an emergency. It was because it was not the entire city that had not the entire Paris was on fire, but just the Notre Dame. I don't know if this was a question.
Perfecto, creo que ya estaría, ¿no? Bueno, vamos a cerrar la encuesta. Muchas gracias. Ahora les voy a mostrar los resultados. Igual esto después va a quedar. Muy bien. Perfecto. Bueno, y ahora vamos a pasar, muchísimas gracias, Alesia, por haber compartido tu experiencia y por haber abierto esta jornada que, bueno, siempre es muy duro empezar a hablar, ¿no? En estos seminarios, así que te agradezco un montón. Bueno, y ahora vamos a pasar a DePacchi. Hola, DePacchi, ¿cómo te va? Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros hoy. Ella nos va a hablar sobre poder entender el valor y la prioridad de las colecciones. DePacchi es doctora y trabaja actualmente como consultora en museos, en el Museo Nacional de los Trenes, digamos, en Nueva Delhi, y en el museo su papel principal... esperen que voy a dejar de compartir esto. Ok, ahí está. Lo dejé de compartir. Bien, entonces en el museo su papel principal es el de llevar adelante el trabajo curatorial en lo que son las salas de exhibición y todo lo que son las galerías al aire libre. También trabaja en diversas exposiciones basadas en diferentes temas, como la conservación de las colecciones y de los archivos. Hizo su graduación en Historia en la Universidad de Nueva Delhi, digamos, su doctorado, y luego siguió una maestría en Conservación, Preservación y Gestión del Patrimonio en la universidad con medalla de oro. También obtuvo el doctorado en el Departamento de Conservación Nacional del Museo, el Instituto Nacional en Nueva Delhi, en India, y comenzó su carrera trabajando como conservadora en Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, en Nueva Delhi, durante casi un año, que esto fue durante el 2010. Luego se unió al National Institute del Museo, donde se ocupó de varios proyectos de conservación de arte, organizó prácticas, talleres, seminarios de conservación, de lo que eran los estudiantes de la maestría en conservación de arte, y especialmente conservación de materiales de papel y prepapel durante 8 años. También fue galardonada con la beca Ernest March para visitar Viena, Austria, para realizar distintos trabajos de investigación, trabajos técnicos relacionados con su doctorado. También participó de varios talleres y conferencias que se realizaron en varias partes de Europa y en Australia, y simultáneamente publicó 11 artículos de investigación a nivel internacional y nacional, revistas, tanto en revistas como en plataformas. En el foro internacional fue recientemente nombrada asistente de coordinador del ICCROM, que es un órgano del el International Council of Museums, y se dedica específicamente a conservación, y su grupo de trabajo es Teoría e Historia de la Conservación. De Pachi recientemente ha participado en uno de los cursos especiales Repensar la gestión del riesgo de desastre para las colecciones del patrimonio cultural, ofrecido por ella entre el año 2020 y 2021, que fue organizado por el ICCROM y sus socios. De Pachi, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí hoy y por brindarnos tu experiencia, y te doy la palabra.
Thank you so much, Virginia, and I'm so sorry for for such long introduction. I couldn't realize I should have given you just 3 lines, and just that would be enough for me to be there. So hello everyone, and I'm very happy to be a part of this seminar. So I'll just share my screen first. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, okay, so Alicia, our mentor, has already shared that, what is DRM, what is the, idea of disaster risk management. But then if you're talking about, this whole concept, it's like a staircase. When we, climb a staircase, we cannot just jump from 1 to 10. We have to go one by one. So every step is like, every presentation is like a step towards that goal. So this, this presentation, understanding the value and then prioritizing the collection, is like, understanding that is the first step to the DRM plan. Okay, so I'll give you an example of, this value thing. When I was doing this, while we were doing our ICCROM Farcolesia course, I kind of relate this with a concept of going to a shopping. So, when you go to a shop, when you decide, you just cannot go randomly and start shopping. But then when you go to a shop, you have a motive. Okay, for example, if I have to go to a shop, I decide to buy a dress. If I have to buy a dress, I have to understand that, until unless you are very fond of window shopping, it's just a different concept altogether. But when you go for a shopping, it's like, for example, if I have to go and shop for a marriage, so then my criteria changes. If I have to go and shop for a party, my criteria will definitely changes. So somewhere I think that understanding the value is like that. You have to understand the value of the collection, because as curator, as a conservator, or the people who are sitting in this seminar, everybody is a part of, museum fraternity. So you must be dealing with the collection part. But then understanding the value is what is the first and foremost thing to understand. So, okay. This is a normal looking stone. If you can just see it, if I see it as it is just like a stone. There's no importance, there's no significance. It's just a stone lying on a floor. Nothing. It just, the only thing which we can cover is it's in black in color. But then if this stone gets into a building, if it becomes a part of a building, or a building like temple, church, mosque, anything which is a spiritual, the value will definitely increases. So it all depends that, the factors will define the value. So one factor can be spiritual factor to define the value of a collection. This one, I mean, if you can see on the left, these are the paintings, and on the right side, these are the sculptures, then the uniforms, dresses of, so all these collection will show and demonstrate the historical importance of such and such era, which it belongs to. So here, the keyword is historical. Again, the factor is historical. So after spiritual, the other thing which can raise a value of a collection is historical. Then if you can see the beautiful vases, the potteries, the decorative art on the wall, this will definitely signify the craftsmanship of the artist who has designed this, who have done the work. So again, the keyword is craftsmanship. The craftsmanship factor will increase the value. So this is another factor. If you see on the right side, everybody knows this is a Mona Lisa painting. So Mona Lisa, you've seen the one piece only, but there are many duplicates. There are many, I'm sure you must have seen a lot of emojis on Facebook, on social media of Mona Lisa, but the fact will always remain the same, that the Mona Lisa is only one. So if it is one, that means it is unique in nature. It is aesthetic. So somehow, again, another factor comes in is unique. So value is the core of heritage. The way we think and live as a society is captured in our collection. For example, for me, for example, this ring for me is like something which is being carried down from my grandmother's time. So for me, it has got a lot of sentiments attached. So it is being, carried from one generation to the other, and now it is with me. For me, it has got a lot of sentiments. But for other people, for people like you, it might be just normal ring. So likewise, I mean, for you, maybe one thing is very, very, dear to you. The collection may be very dear to me. For me, it is not. So this is how the reciprocation happens. The way we think and live as a society is captured in our collection. What we think, how we live is always captured in our collection. So it is heritage because we value it. However, there can be many reasons for, valuing or not valuing certain things. It all depends on our personal bias. Somewhere down the line, it just works. Different types of value, as I just shared, that, it may be historical, technological, association, spiritual, craftsmanship, aesthetic, anything. But these are all the factors which can play as as defining a value. But again, value changes over time. Today, what we think, what we value, maybe in another 100 years, it might change. So it always changes over time. It is intergenerational, as I just said. So value depends on who is assessing. If I am assessing, then of course the value changes. If you're assessing or the other person is assessing, the value changes. So this is how the value works. I'll again, just give you a brief. Spiritual, we've already discussed. Historical factor, unique factor, maybe some technological factor, craftsmanship factor. This association factor can be anything. For example, if I see a vase, a beautiful vase in a documentary, talking about how it has been excavated or something like that. So I have seen it on the screen, on a web series or on a documentary. So somehow my connection or the value of that thing will definitely rises up. Now, when you have, that these are the factors for value. This is how the value is being defined. These are the factors for the value. then you work on the value distribution. Because in my museum, for example, there are 10 galleries. So 10 galleries have 100 collections.
Bueno, se le debe haber cortado internet a Depache. Esperemos que vuelva en breve. Bueno, esperamos 5 minutos, si no puede sumarse nuevamente, podemos seguir con Ripoll. Sí. Debe haber tenido un inconveniente técnico.
Yeah, I think it's a part of this
Yes. Yes.
seminar.
Yes. I don't know if Ripoll is here.
Yes.
Maybe he can start.
Yes, Virginia, I am here.
Oh,
Good evening,
hello.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, I'm good.
Perfecto. Constanza, ¿estás por ahí? ¿Así lo podés presentar? Te vamos a... Ok. You can start. Ok. Constanza, are you there? Ok, no te preocupes, voy a presentarte yo.
Ah, dale.
No, dale, si estás ahí.
No, ya dijiste que ibas vos, ahora seguí tranquila.
Ok, bueno. Bueno, Ripoll va a hablar sobre poder entender el riesgo y los componentes del riesgo y además este camino que lleva a este proceso de riesgo. Ripoll es un científico informático de corazón y un profesional de la gestión de riesgos de desastre. Prefiere llamarse a sí mismo en parte académico y en parte participante. Después de una maestría en mitigación y gestión de desastres y un doctorado en el Instituto Indio de Tecnología Rocky, actualmente trabaja en el gobierno de Gujarat, en el Instituto de Manejo de Desastres de Gujarat, como científico de investigación y gerente de programas. Tiene el cargo adicional de oficial de investigación del Centro de Manejo de Desastres de la SAARC con el gobierno de la India. Es profesor visitante en diferentes universidades, como NIPER-AR, GSFCU, y está asociado, como joven científico, a la investigación integrada sobre riesgos de desastres, que es una plataforma de investigación interdisciplinaria del Consejo Científico Internacional y la Oficina de las Naciones Unidas para la Reducción de Riesgos de Desastre. Por otro lado, es miembro fundador de la Plataforma Nacional de Jóvenes y Jóvenes Profesionales de la India que trabajan en la gestión de riesgos de desastres y la adaptación al cambio climático, conocida como Confederation of Risk Reduction Professionals. La plataforma cuenta actualmente con más de 200 miembros de diferentes orígenes, provenientes de universidades y organizaciones de renombre en todo el mundo. La CRRP es parte de la alianza UNSPIRE, que es un movimiento global en todo el mundo apoyado por UNDRR y la UNESCO. Es un emprendedor social y está involucrado en los institutos de riesgos y resiliencia que asumen proyectos innovadores en el cambio de la gestión de riesgo y de desastre en campos afines. Ripoll tiene un gran interés en integrar la conciencia cultural colectiva de una comunidad, conocimiento indígena, prácticas culturales, en la reducción de riesgos de desastres. Es un primer auxiliar cultural capacitado para ayudar al campo cultural en tiempos de crisis por el ICCROM, así que, bueno, después de este enorme currículum, le vamos a dar la palabra entonces a Ripoll. Ripoll, lo único que quería solicitarte es que por favor nos hables despacio para que las traductoras puedan poco a poco traducirte, porque hablas muy rápido. Bueno, bienvenido, muchas gracias y te doy la palabra.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening from India. Actually, it's sundown, almost sundown here. And I have been asked to present and discuss about risk path. Apologies because I would be talking in English, and I do understand that language is a huge barrier when we talk about disaster risk management as such. So bear with me. I will try to be as simple and as lucid as possible. And if you have any questions, any problems whatsoever, please do stop me and you can ask me. I may not be able to answer all the questions, but I'm very confident that since Alicia is also here with us today, it will become very easy. If someone can just confirm if my screen is visible so that we can start off.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And since we are going to talk about risk path, it's very important that we understand what risk actually is. So breaking it down into very simple English, risk is the likelihood or the chance of something unwanted or something bad happening. It is as simple as that, right? So if we extend this understanding of risk to disaster risk, it is the likelihood or chance of a disaster happening. It's very simple, right? The understanding is simple, but what happens is that when we break down disaster risk, it forms three very important components which we need to look into. The three components are hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Now, to understand risk, or even to understand risk path, it is very important that we understand what hazard is, what exposure is, and what vulnerability is. And only then can we probably be able to understand risk in its full plethora, full spectrum of it, right? So since disaster risk is the probability of a disaster happening or a chance of a disaster happening, we also need to understand what disaster is. Now, I would like all of you to take a pause and think about the fact that the understanding, the definition of disaster is very different in the different parts of the world, right? For example, in India, we have a legal definition of disaster. At the international or global level, there is an international understanding what disaster is, which has been established by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Similarly, in your countries, you also may have a legal definition of disaster. I'm not talking about the definition of disaster that we come across in any dictionary. That's very different. That's completely different. What I'm talking about is the legal definition, which is in a way defined by the government of the nation or the state, right? So since we are all on an international platform, I would like to point out the international or the globally accepted definition of disaster, which is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, right? This is exactly what we saw in the last slide. It is made up of three very important components: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And when these three components interact with each other, what happens is there's an outcome event. Something happens, right? Now, if that event is within the coping capacity of the community or the organization or the state or the province, then it is not a disaster. If it goes beyond the coping capacity, then it is a disaster. So this is a very subjective understanding that we have of disaster, because depending upon the capacities of different states, different institutes, different organizations, different nations, disaster can be very relative, very subjective, and very different for everyone. So what I'm trying to point out here is that when we use terms like risk, disaster risk, or disaster for that matter, we need to be very careful of what we actually mean. Many a times I have come across, since I have the privilege of working with the government here, many a times what happens is that there are events which probably can be termed as emergencies, or let's say just an accident perhaps, right? But people have the tendency to tag that particular event as a disaster. We need to understand that the term disaster has a very widespread effect and impact. When we are talking about disaster, we mean lots of things. I mean, people's lives are lost, buildings are damaged, infrastructure is damaged, right? Livelihoods lost, so many things. So that is completely different. And a mere accident or a fire event is not a disaster until and unless the consequences are way beyond our capacity. So I do understand that it is very tricky to understand the difference, but there is a very fine difference. So we need to understand that disaster risk is the chance or the probability of a disaster happening, and disaster is a has a very wide understanding, has a very wide interpretation where we involve communities. It is bigger than a single institution or a single organization for that matter. It involves communities, it involves societies, right? So this we have to be very clear of. So now when we merge the understanding of risk and the understanding of disaster, and we try to establish an accepted definition of disaster risk, it is the potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damaged assets. So it's very simple, right? We are talking about the chance or the probability or the potential of lives being lost, of injuries, of destruction and damage of assets. As simple as that. And it is very important that we understand that when we're talking about disaster risk, we are talking about probability. We are talking about chance, right? In its very understanding, it's very proactive. We are not talking about managing a consequence or managing a disaster. We are talking about managing disaster risk. That is something which has not yet happened, but can eventually lead into a disaster. So we are talking about managing that particular risk. So which can eventually lead on to potential losses of life, injury, or damage of assets. So this is a very fundamental understanding of disaster. This is of disaster risk. Now that we have understood this, we need to understand that since we are talking about understanding of disaster risk being proactive, that is something which has not yet happened. The disaster is yet to kind of translate it, right? So we need to understand that how we can manage those particular risks. So as we were talking, hazard interacts with exposure, which interacts with the vulnerability of the exposed assets and elements. I know that terminologies are very difficult in a way to understand, and particularly in this context, but I will try to explain it as simply as possible. So a hazard can be a natural hazard, it can be a man-made hazard, natural hazard as an earthquake, for example, hurricanes, typhoons, tsunamis. These are natural hazards. Now, these hazards interact with exposure as an elements which are of interest to us, right? And if these elements of interest are vulnerable or are weak and they cannot withstand the effect or the impact of the hazard, it would eventually lead to an event, right? Now, this event necessarily need not be a disaster, as I was saying. It can be an emergency. It will not result in the serious disruption of the functioning of the community or the society. The organization or the institute or the small section of the society may come to a halt, but it will not be disrupted. So there are chances that we can still bounce back to life as usual, to life as normal, right? But what happens is that when all of these elements come together, combine together, and they overwhelm our awareness, they overwhelm our preparedness, that is when it translates the risk. The chance actually becomes a consequence, a disaster. So the bottom line of all of this is that when the coping capacity of the community, it can be a community, it can be a state, it can be institute or an organization like your museum, like your place where you collect your artifacts or your exhibits, this organization fails to deal with the event or that emergency situation, it becomes a disaster. So we need to be very careful of how we tag these events. Are they just events? Are they just accidents? Or are they actually disasters, right? So this needs to be very clear. And this happens only when we as a community or as members of any institute or organization fail to cope up with the effects and impacts, right? So this is a very simple understanding of how risk translates into a disaster. Now, until and unless we understand this entire thing through examples, we will probably not be able to understand it. So let me break it down into a very generic manner, so that we develop a fundamental understanding, and then we will run through 3 cases where we kind of look into all these aspects individually in a segmented fashion. So as I was saying, hazards can be natural hazards, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, man-made hazards, the most common one being fire. Now, these hazards interact with exposure. What is exposure? Exposure is simply the elements of interest that might get affected by the hazard. For example, when we talk about earthquake does not take place in a very small region, right? So let's say a full area, a full community, or a full district, a full province is affected. So all the buildings there, all the infrastructure that's there, all the people, all the communities that they are there, they are the ones who are exposed to the hazard, which is earthquake in this case. For example, if the hazard is fire, the exposure becomes very different. For example, if the fire starts from an electrical short circuit and it eventually blows up into a big full-blown fire, then it starts from a room, right? And due to the failure of the institute or the organization to control it, to control the spread of it, what happens? It moves from one room to another room, eventually engulfing the entire building. And along with the rooms, what happens is all the artifacts, all the exhibits that are placed inside, they're all gone. So all these things, in some cases, the museum that we have, the building is very important to us. It's perhaps a building which is 100 years old and it's of huge significance to us, right? So in case of an earthquake, of course, the building is a problem. It's old. It probably might not be structurally so strong to withstand an earthquake. So there are many things that can be exposed. So the building itself can be exposed. The rooms, depending upon the hazard, we need to understand what all elements of interest or what all assets are exposed. For example, if let's say in case of a museum, if there is no proper security facilities available, then all the artifacts and exhibits that you probably have placed inside is exposed to the hazard of theft, right? So depending upon the hazard, you will need to understand what your exposure is. Moving on to the third, but the most important element is vulnerability. There can be hazard, there can be elements of interest or assets which are exposed to the hazard, but the extent of damage, the extent of loss is actually determined by this factor, which is vulnerability, right? For example, there can be an earthquake, and let's say a building which is 60, 70 years old is exposed to that particular hazard, which is earthquake. But somehow the construction of the building is very good and it has been capable of withstanding the earthquake. So it means that there was a hazard which interacted with the exposure, which is the building here, but the building was not vulnerable, it was strong. So it was not even an event. It was just an earthquake that happened. It came, it shook the place, and it went away. It's as simple as that. So nothing big to worry about. So depending upon the hazard, depending upon the exposure, we have to look at vulnerabilities. For example, in case when we are talking about earthquake, we are definitely looking at building strength. We are looking at the condition of the building, if it's old or not. If the hazard of concern is flooding, for example, here, maybe I'm aware that there is a problem of flooding, but still I have not taken any step to flood proof it. For example, I know that every year due to heavy rainfall, what happens is that the ground floor of my institute is completely flooded, but being ignorant, what happens, or being just uninterested, what happens is that I keep all my valuable exhibits and artifacts on the ground floor itself, so that every year there is this constant exercise that whenever there is heavy rainfall, I bring all my stuff and we grab all the artifacts and exhibits and then move and then place it somewhere else. So knowing all these things, I'm still not making my institute, my building flood-proof, right? So there are two dimensions of vulnerability at play here. One, I am aware that it's flood-prone, but still not doing. So that is my attitudinal vulnerability. I'm just not interested in doing it. Maybe I know how to flood-proof my building. I know ways how to protect my artifacts and exhibits, but I do not have the funds or the finances that I require to flood-proof it. It can happen. It's very common. And I think you would probably know this better than me, that these are actual problems. And the most interesting part of vulnerability is that this is one dimension, this is one aspect of risk or one aspect of a disaster event which remains invisible, mostly invisible, until and unless the event happens, until and unless that event becomes an emergency or it becomes a disaster. We never know that these are the points of failure that actually existed in the system for a very long time. Just to give you a very simple example, most of us go back to our house and we have a very comfortable life. But how many of us actually, very consciously think that is my house strong enough to withstand an earthquake? We do not. Probably while having tea, while having coffee, we make a very friendly discussion with a friend, but that's just about it. And when there is an actual earthquake and my building shakes, I tremble in fear and probably the building next to me falls down. That is when I realized I knew this. I knew my building was not strong enough. I knew there was a problem, but still somehow I ignored it. I was aware, but still I ignored it. So the faulty structure of the building, the strength of the building was not good, and somehow I knew it, but I ignored it. So that's why this is one dimension which most of the time remains invisible to us. And it's only after an event, it's only after a consequence that we retrospect and analyze, oh, I missed this. This is actually why this happened, right? And when this event transpires, everything coming together, hazard, exposure, vulnerability coming together, and then there's a very critical situation at hand. Are we prepared to respond? Can the institute, can the organization, is the community empowered enough to cope with the impacts? This is also very important. See, what happens is that most of the time what happens is that we think of all these things and probably take into account 2 or 3 measures that we feel that this is enough. This is how I am going to flood-proof my building. This is how I'm going to fire-proof my rooms, and just about it, that's it, done. But being in this particular field of disaster management, we must always be aware of something which is very interesting to me, that is Murphy's Law. Murphy's Law states that if something has to go wrong, it will eventually go wrong. So you can prepare to prevent any hazard, a fire from starting with immense amount of vigilance. You can prepare to mitigate the impacts of, let's say, an earthquake or a flood, right? But you also have to be equally mindful to be prepared to respond to an event, right? Maybe you are just prepared to respond to an earthquake of, let's say, 5 or 6 intensity, right? But what if the intensity is like 9 or 10? Are you prepared enough to respond to that? And if that happens, there will obviously be consequences. Are you empowered enough? Do you have the capacity? Do you have the capacity to cope with those impacts? That is how the entire risk gets translated into an event. Now, this is theoretically, this is very easy for us to understand, right? Depending upon our preparedness to respond, depending upon how we can cope with the impact, it's very interesting to understand this theoretically. But what is required is for us to understand this through case studies, through examples. So we will run through 3 cases. The first one is very common to all of us. The second one would be one from my country, from India. And the third one would be to especially focus on what I personally like very much, Murphy's Law. So the first case is, of course, you all are very aware of the incident, the National Museum of Brazil, September 2018, what happened. We will just run through the conditions or the scenario which led to the fire. So as far as researches were done and suggested, maybe you know better than me, but this is the overall generic idea that I could develop by going through the studies that were conducted post the event. An improperly installed air conditioning unit on the ground floor of Brazil's National Museum ignited the September 28 blaze that raised the 200-year-old cultural institution and reduced the majority of its 20 million artifact collection to ashes. We all know this. How did this happen? The air conditioners failed to meet manufacturer recommendations regarding the use of separate circuit breakers. Please note this point. These are very, very important. Generally, when we do post-disaster analysis, we do mention all this, but we take them very casually. But the point is that we need to understand that these are the small points of failure, which until and unless we take into account in the next steps of recovery, these are the mistakes which will still be there. And eventually, again, one fire will lead to a similar disaster. And I think a similar kind of fire also happened in 2020, if I'm not wrong, maybe 2021, I'm not very sure. I'm just confusing the years because of the pandemic, but probably in 2020. And on top of that, the air conditioners failed to meet the manufacturer recommendations that's there. But on top of that, inadequate safety measures throughout the museum facilitated the spread of the fire. Now, this is the entire scenario, right? It's like a very generic version of what happened. If we want to analyze this through the risk path or by breaking it down into the components of disaster risk, let's see what happens. So the hazard here is fire, but the fire happened due to a short circuit, right? What is the exposure in this case? No, so the fire started in the ground floor, and that was the hazard. Eventually, the hazard, that is the fire, started spreading, of course, because there were combustible materials available. There was ample amount of oxygen to kind of continue the fire, so it spread. What is the exposure here? Of course, the building itself is exposed because the fire kept on spreading. And remember, there was no installations of fire protection inside, which we already saw in the last slide. So the building, the artifact, the exhibits, 20 million exhibits, all exposed, right? What were the vulnerabilities that led to this particular event? Compliance failure, which we saw, it failed the manufacturer's compliance. No manual checks. This is very important. We have grown to rely more on technology, but we often forget that we do need manual checks, right? We do need manual vigilance. We cannot always just rely on technology. So there were no manual checks, lack of fire protection systems, lack of preparedness to respond to the event. Probably if there were fire detection systems in place, probably, just probably, maybe the fire could have been contained within a room or a two, maybe, but there was no fire protection systems. There was no preparedness to respond to it. And when I was going through all this, I found that there was this constant element that was coming up in every document that I was going through: lack of funding, right? So you see that to install fire protection systems, to train the museum staff to be prepared to respond to such an event, you need funding. If the administration of the institute or the organization is not interested, not willing, or simply just because of any other reason is economically not doing well, they will not be able to, put up these kind of systems of prevention. They will not be able to put up or train people to be prepared to respond to such events. And interestingly, now that we are retrospecting, we understand that these problems, like had this event not happened, would anyone have ever imagined that there was this compliance failure? Would anyone have worried that there were no manual checks? Would anyone have worried that there was no fire protection systems, or even if there was, it was not working? It happens very often. We keep on seeing, we keep on discussing, but when it's time to implement it, we generally, kind of overlook it. So, and because this event happened, now we are retrospecting and we are seeing, oh my God, these are the things that actually led to this event, right? And if this event not happened, we would probably have not looked back into these factors which contributes to the vulnerabilities. We would not have, right? So when we are preparing for disaster risk management, we will have to foresee these vulnerabilities. We will have to understand that these are the vulnerabilities, these are the points of failure, which will eventually lead to this particular event. This will eventually lead to this very catastrophic event, right? We'll have to foresee it. Now let us talk about the consequence of the event. What happened? 20 million artifacts gone. So much of history was collected, not just of the nation, but of entire mankind. Gone, right? Now, depending upon this consequence, depending upon the economic consequence, depending upon the artifacts lost, depending upon the heritage lost, depending upon so much of memories that are lost, knowledge that is lost. Now, you have to understand whether you want to categorize it in an emergency event, in an accident, in a fire accident, or it is a disaster. This is the tricky part. You have to decide. In fact, if I can talk for my country, this decision usually rests with the government, right? If the government is not interested, then it will merely remain as a fire accident. That this happened and this much of artifacts or exhibits were lost. This was the economic loss, and that's about it. But if the government is interested, if there are actual consequences which can blow up to any proportions, then probably it will be declared as a disaster. So herein, depending upon the consequence of the event, the declaration or the notification of disaster becomes important. Had there been proper systems there to control the spread of fire, had there been proper systems to respond to the event, we probably would have been able to save the consequences. We would have not seen this catastrophic consequence. But nevertheless, this is how it played out. The next case that I would be talking about is something that happened in 2016 in our nation's capital, Delhi Natural History Museum. Let's run through the scenario. So in the early morning of 26th April, a fire broke out in the museum and destroyed the entire collection. So this is the summary. How it happened: the fire, which began around 1:30 on the 6th floor of that building. So the fire did not start in the museum itself. It started in a floor which was above it, right? So it eventually reached the 2nd floor and destroyed all of the museum's exhibits before fire services were able to bring the flames under control. The cause of the fire is still unknown, although the fire spread was fueled by museum specimens and the woodwork holding them. And the reports which were done post the event, it reported that the devastating effect of the blaze was due to the building's sprinkler system, which was being out of order. Right? Now let's again do this analysis. So the hazard in this case is also a fire. What is the exposure? The fire started on the 6th floor, right? So had that particular floor had proper fire protection systems, then it would not have spread into other floors. That's very simple to understand, right? But somehow it did not. So the 6th floor was the exposure initially, and depending upon the spread and the growth of fire, it eventually reached to the 2nd floor, and the artifacts and the exhibits which were placed there, it also was affected and impacted. Now let's look at the vulnerabilities. Again, doing a retrospective analysis of what happened. Lack of fire protection systems. In fact, it was there, but it was out of order. Lack of preparedness to respond. Now, the fire brigades did respond, but somehow the time lag made it very difficult for them to respond in a manner in which they could have probably saved many exhibits or artifacts. And the third most important thing that I would like to highlight is that the fire probably would have somehow lost its intensity, lost its capability to grow, but the wooden framework which was holding those artifacts worked as a combustible article, and it enhanced the fire. When we are talking about fire, there are three very important things that kind of instigate the fire, right? One is oxygen, one is heat, temperature, another is the fuel. So to prevent a fire from happening, you will have to cut out any of these three. But unfortunately, the holder, the items were kept in the holders, which were wooden, and it is of course a combustible thing. Now, retrospectively, it is very easy to understand, right? But imagine if you are trying to plan for this, that this is something that possibly can happen. Would you have taken into account that the woodwork which was holding those items would become a vulnerability? It would instigate more fire. It will help in the growth of the fire. Probably if you are an expert and you have seen this incident, you would have considered it. But normally, maybe not. Maybe not. I'm giving the benefit of doubt to you. You may have or you may not have considered. So looking at the translation, the path of translation of risk, and when we look and try to plan for what can happen in the future, we have to take account of what possible hazards can affect my institute, my place, my community, my organization, my museum, and what are all those things that are exposed. And then comes the most important part, where we try to understand what are those points which will actually define the extent of damage, the extent of loss. What are those vulnerabilities? And I'm telling you once again, those elements remain invisible to us most of the time. And until and unless we do a very, very thorough analysis, we will not understand what can go wrong. Even a delay of, let's say, 30 seconds to call up the fire brigade to respond can lead to a massacre. Trust me, this can also happen. So it's a huge thing, understanding the vulnerabilities, and no one expects that you understand all the vulnerabilities. It's not possible. It's humanly not possible. But we have to make sure that we understand those vulnerabilities as much as possible, so that the event does not become a disaster. Now, coming to the fourth, last part, that is the event. All the artifacts gone again, the history, knowledge, memory, all gone, wiped off. Is this a disaster? Again, for my country, it depends upon the administration to declare if it is a disaster or not. Otherwise, it would just remain as a fire accident. This is the most interesting one, and all of you probably know this, the Great East Japan earthquake, which led to a tsunami in March 2011. A very small scenario. The libraries in this particular area, in the coastal area, they were all swept away, right? And many others reported the premises were damaged, and you know how it is. You have seen the videos and you know what it is like after a tsunami. So let us try to analyze this hazard. This is interesting. All this while we were talking about one single hazard affecting us, fire, let's say maybe even an earthquake. This is a unique case where an earthquake on the seafloor led to a tsunami. The earthquake alone did not have any problem. Even the people there were ready. Even I know, probably you know that Japanese are very, very prudent, and they're very, kind of used to it, and they're prepared to respond to these kind of events. Earthquake was not a problem. What they were probably not prepared for was the ensuing tsunami that followed. The buildings, they are in a way earthquake proof. So whatever the artifacts, the exhibits they have inside, they are in a way safe. But what do you do when this earthquake triggers a tsunami? It goes beyond your control. You may have prepared for anything. This is where Murphy's law actually proves itself to be true. All of your preparedness just gets washed away because you are not prepared for the tsunami, right? So you are prepared to respond to an earthquake, but you are not prepared to respond to a tsunami. What do you do? And here the vulnerability is uncertainty. So in all the other examples, what we saw is that we could still understand our vulnerabilities. Okay, this is missing. This is not done. This is something that we could have done. We can do it. But how can you possibly prepare for a tsunami? I mean, you can go around and build huge walls, but is that even very practical approach? So here, what I'm trying to point out is that you can never understand all the dimensions of vulnerability. There will always be a small amount of uncertainty. And that is where we have to be very careful about. And the event in this case, in the previous two cases, we were still debating about whether it's an accident, whether it's a disaster. And if it's a disaster, why it's a disaster? Because of so much of losses, so much of knowledge lost, so much of history lost. But this is evidently, provenly a disaster. Why? Because the effect and impact is not limited to a single institute, to a single organization, to a single building. Whole of the city, whole of communities have been affected and impacted. People have lost their lives, people have lost their livelihoods, right? So now, due to the widespread effect and impact, there's no doubt that this is a disaster. So this is my last slide, and I hope that I have been able to make you understand how disaster risk translates into a disaster, right? The hazard, interacting with the exposure, interacting with the vulnerability. This is the path it follows and eventually becomes an event. And if the consequence of the event is too much for us, our organization, our state to cope up with, then it becomes a disaster. So let's talk about how do we, in a way, manage, control, prevent the risk path. It's very simple. If we go by this understanding, it's very simple. Hazard. Can you prevent a hazard from happening? If it's a fire, yes, you can. You can be very vigilant. You can put up fire detection systems. You can put up sprinkler systems, and you can prevent from fire. Obviously it will start, but then it will not spread. So you can do it. Flood. As I was mentioning, if you are aware that heavy rainfall every year leads to flooding of my ground floor, you can prevent it. You can take measures, you can take steps which can prevent the flood, which can prevent the water incoming. So that can be done. But there are hazards which are very complex for us to understand. For example, the earthquake leading to a tsunami, as we just saw in case of Japan. In case of Indonesia, there was one added problem. Earthquake causing tsunami, causing liquefaction. Liquefaction is a process where the in the soil, due to the shaking of the earth, what happens is the soil goes down and the water content comes up. So any building, any foundation on that simply just sinks down, right? So there are hazards which we can prevent, and then there are hazards which we definitely cannot prevent, like these. Even very complex for us to kind of imagine that this can happen. So for that, we need to move on to the next step, exposure. For example, in case of fire or in case of flood, how can you reduce exposure? Simply by moving or securing the items or the artifacts or the exhibits. In case of, let's say, earthquake, can you reduce the exposure? Because in case of an earthquake, your entire building, your entire museum is exposed. You cannot move your museum to another place, which is probably not prone to earthquake. You cannot do that, right? So in such cases, you move to the third step, where you try to reduce the vulnerabilities. For example, if you are talking about earthquake, as we discussed, we cannot reduce the exposure. The building itself is exposed, so you can't help it. But we can reduce the vulnerability, right? What all we can do? Probably I know that the building is old and it will not be able to withstand the earthquake. So what I do is I bring in structural engineers, I bring in civil engineers, and they do an auditing of the building, and they suggest that these are the things, this kind of retrofitting you should do, and your building will be able to survive, let's say, 7 or 8 intensity earthquakes. So that is one thing. But these are merely recommendations and suggestions. We need funding, we need finances to implement it. Now, maybe you are lucky, so your organization is forthcoming and says that, okay, this is very much required, and go ahead and do it. In some cases, your organization, your bosses may not be so forthcoming and say, no, see, this earthquake of this intensity, it will come in the next 50-60 years, doesn't matter. By that time, I will not be the director of this museum, so no problem with it. So these kind of things adds into the vulnerability. Although you know how to probably mitigate the impacts of the earthquake, how to control the building from going down, you will not be able to do it, because probably there are attitudinal problems, there is socio-economical problem, maybe you do not have funds enough to do it. And again, maybe in case of fire, you are just not in a position, you are in a socio-cultural context or in a political situation where there are other issues at play, bigger issues at play, and preparing your museum or organization for responding to a fire is not that important. That can also happen. So these are the vulnerabilities that you have to take care of, right? And all of this brought together, whether you can prevent a hazard or not, whether you can reduce the exposure or not, what can you do to reduce your vulnerabilities, what can you do to increase your capacities, will finally decide whether that accident, whether that event remains a hazardous event, or it becomes a disaster, right? So this is how disaster risk, which is made up of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, culminates or translates into a disaster, or merely an event that depends upon how well we are prepared, how well we are aware, and how well we are taking steps to increase our capacities. So I guess that would be all from my side, and I hope I have been able to explain how the risk path actually works using the components. So if there are questions, I'm open to questions. Thank you so much for indulging me.
Muchísimas gracias, Ripoll, por tan detallado informe sobre el camino del riesgo en las instituciones, y muchas veces, y eso es lo que vamos a ver, ¿no? Sobre todo en países como Latinoamérica, lo que sucede es que no tenemos el presupuesto, como decías vos, para enfrentar estas situaciones, y a veces muy pequeñas cambios de conciencia, cambios de comportamiento, simplemente situaciones, digo, como poner un matafuegos delante de una puerta, pueden solucionar, digamos, un evento que puede incrementarse, ¿no? Bueno, vamos a pasar a Deepaksji muy rápido antes de seguir. Estamos un poquito demorados, pero bueno, vamos a tratar de hacerlo lo más rápido posible. Nuestro problema más grave es las intérpretes que, bueno, que no tienen todo el día available. Así que, bueno, le damos la palabra a Deepaksji entonces, para continuar.
Thank you, Virginia, and I'm so sorry that I lost the internet. And trust me, I was just going on, and after 4 slides, I realized that the connection was gone. So, then I kind of tried. So I'll just wrap the whole presentation in another 10 minutes, and I will share the screen. Is it visible to all?
Sí, yes.
Thank you. So I think we were here when I lost the connection. Okay. So as I was saying, that the value changes over time and it is intergenerational. I'll just put because I think my internet is going. So that is where the value changes over time. It is intergenerational, and value depends on who is assessing. Maybe it might change what you accessing and how it changes when I access. So as discussed, that there are various factors to create a value pie. So you have to see the spiritual factor, the historical factor, maybe some unique or aesthetic factor, technological factor, craftsmanship factor. I forgot to mention about association factor. For example, if I say that, if we see an excavation of a pot in a documentary and it is all, there in your museum, so that association somehow will attract people. That is where the value will increases. So, yeah. When you know the factors, you create a pie. You have a building wherein you have 10 galleries. So in every gallery, there are different collections. But then what is important is to create an index of, realizing what is very high in value and what is very low in value. So I'll just go straight to my own case study where I'm working right now, National Rail Museum, New Delhi, India. So we have a rail museum, which is, which has got, which is spread in 11 acres land. And we have an outdoor section. We do have an indoor gallery, and we have an administrative gallery and archive. So when we plan anything, and when we, as I said in the initial slides of my presentation, that when you're planning to do DRM plan, there are some steps to go towards it. You cannot just jump from 1 to 10. So this is one thing that, you should have your own floor plan. And then if you have a floor plan just next to you, you will be able to, figure out things more clearly. So when we were doing value distribution, I kind of took my floor plan and I kind of located what all sections are there and what kind of collection are there. And if you can see the yellow ones, these are the star exhibits, which we call it as, but these are all unique. I mean, one pieces, or they're just one pieces available in our country. So this is how we have kind of drafted it. Just a glimpse of what is there in my outdoor section. We have more than 90 life exhibits, in the outdoor section, and these are all locomotives, Royal Saloons. So these are all life-size exhibits, all big locomotives, wagons, and everything exhibited in open area. So I just took a part of the outdoor section, and I again further drafted them and divided them as per the gauges, because in the railways we see the gauges by. So in broad gauge, then meter gauge and narrow gauge. Then further in gauges, we try to understand that what all positions of star exhibits are there. So then another bifurcation. Then on that basis, we kind of made a percentage of what percentage of value is there in specific gauge. For example, broad gauge, we have 35%, meter gauge, in narrow gauge, 30%, like that. This was outdoor. If we come into the indoor section, it's an octagonal building wherein we have 6 sections inside the building. And all those 6 sections have different collections. So it has working models. It do have signaling equipments, antique furnitures, historical photographs, philately collections, metal passes, if you can see these. Then we do have badges and some other related literature. So then again, I know that these are the collection which is there in such and such sections. But then, you have to understand that, for example, in history section, I have 50 collection. In transport section, I have 20 collection. Maybe the history section are, they have big collection, but still there might be other reasons to consider that. So then I kind of made, a value pie that how history collections have got, like for example, in this history collection, we have 2 objects from York Museum. So we have a loan collection. So if we have a loan collection, automatically the value increases. Then we have this in reception area, we have tickets, like tickets of some special trains. So first ticket, it would be only with me. Not everybody can have a first ticket of a special train. So this is how the value factors will be defined. So have I again lost you all?
No, I'm here.
No, we are here.
We're here.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't know, this presentation is going ahead. Just a second. Okay, can you all see this?
No.
Now?
No. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So now you have distributed your value. You know that this is the first step to value distribution of the collection. You understand where the collection's value is located and how much the value collection can be affected in case of disaster. Again, one thing I missed on to saying that I know in my museum I have such and such collections, but I am not aware what kind of collection you have. So when you are doing it, you are the right person to understand that what all factors needs to be considered. So yeah, this thing I forgot, so I am mentioning that. So the first step is value distribution. You have to understand that and maybe what can it be affected in case of a disaster. The second step, when you know the value distribution, what is the second step is to make a priority list, which helps in the case of an emergency disaster. So when we were doing this ICCROM Farcolesha course, we were given an activity wherein we were being asked that you have 5 minutes of understanding that you have a scenario wherein the fire has broke out and the collection is almost in a very bad condition, and you have only 5 minutes to just take one object. So what would be the priority of that? I mean, how do you say that you want to take that one collection? So when we were doing this activity, I was very confused that I thought that everything is so important in the museum. Everything is very, very relevant and important. But on what basis I should prioritize? So one thing which we have already discussed so far, the value, it may be historical, spiritual, uniqueness, community identity, maybe intangible factors that are involved, economical, etc. But then if you think about a disaster, if there is a disaster, your priority might slightly change. If there is a fire broke out in the museum, you go inside and you see a book which is unique in nature, but somehow if you just lift it up, it is gone forever. So you will only focus on those things which is feasible to you can just take that out. So you have to understand, and maybe as I just showed you the models which are there in my Indo collection, so they are quite heavy, but I find them very rare. But I just cannot go inside and lift it up and come out. So I have to understand that these three important these three things needs to be considered. One is vulnerability, that one vulnerable, as Repol has already talked about so much about vulnerability, so I will not go into that. But what is the dimension? Are you being able to lift it up? And what is the condition? Is it very fragile or is it in a sound condition? So this is how the priority decides. So if I go to the next slide, come on. Okay, yes. So just to summarize it, the value, these are the factors which needs to be considered. Value changes over time. And then you have to distribute the value distribution. And then when you distribute the value, you know how to prioritize it. So thank you so much for all the attention. And I'm so sorry for all the inconvenience from my side.
De Pachi, muchísimas gracias por haber presentado o terminado de presentar esta necesidad de entender sobre el valor de las colecciones y cómo esto va cambiando conforme pasan las gestiones y determinadas situaciones políticas que tienen que ver con las instituciones. Así que muchísimas gracias.
Bien, la próxima presentación es Escenario MHS con Virginia González. Y ahora voy a presentarte, Virginia, tú ves. Actualmente Virginia es directora del Museo Histórico Sarmiento, es directora de estudios de la Facultad de Artes y de la Universidad del Museo Social Argentino, es presidente de ASINPPAC, Asociación Internacional para la Protección del Patrimonio Cultural, es licenciada también en Museología, especializada en restauración de libros y documentos, magíster internacional en Dirección y Gestión de Museos por por ESNECA Business School. Es diplomada en gestión cultural por la Universidad de San Martín, diplomada en gestión con orientación en colecciones por el Instituto Latinoamericano ILAN, y actualmente ha entregado su tesis de maestría en historia con orientación en artes y se encuentra esperando su defensa, cursando maestría en curaduría en la UNTREF. Este es el currículum resumido de Virginia. Virginia, muchas gracias por estar aquí con nosotros hoy también, y the floor is yours.
Gracias, Ana, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, luego de que voy a tratar de ser breve para no extendernos en el tiempo, pero luego de que habló Alesia, Ripoll y de Pachi, para poder entender conjuntamente cuál es el peligro, cuál es el valor que tienen nuestras colecciones y cómo se enfrentan a estas situaciones de peligro, ¿no? Cuáles son nuestras fortalezas y debilidades frente a eso. Lo que les voy a mostrar es qué hizo el Museo Sarmiento con toda esta información para poder utilizarla en un escenario. Entonces, bueno, para quienes no conozcan el lugar, muy rápidamente les comento que estamos en Argentina, en la provincia de Buenos Aires, específicamente en la ciudad de Buenos Aires, y dentro de la ciudad de Buenos Aires, en lo que es el barrio de Belgrano. Aquí no se puede ver bien, tal vez es mejor verlo de esta manera. Este es el Museo Sarmiento. Aquí, como pueden ver, el río está no muy lejos de la institución. Y aquí podemos ver, este es el Museo Sarmiento. Enfrente tenemos otro museo, el Museo Larreta, que es de otra administración. Enfrente del museo directamente está una plaza, y cruzando esa plaza tenemos lo que se conoce como la Iglesia Redonda. Esto sería respecto a los espacios culturales. En relación entonces con lo que rodea el edificio, tenemos, pensando que este es nuestro museo, aquí está la Larreta, esta es la plaza, la iglesia, la policía y los bomberos. O sea que tenemos los departamentos de policía y bomberos bastante cercanos al museo, y esto nos da determinadas ventajas, ¿no? Frente a determinadas situaciones. Acá hay otra vista, ¿no? Aquí podemos ver, este es el museo específicamente y la plaza que les comentaba, y en esta esquina estaría ubicado el otro museo, que es el Museo Larreta. Simplemente para tener un panorama de cuál es nuestra realidad, porque como decía Alesia al principio, tenemos que pensar, ¿no?, en la región y ir desde lo general a lo particular para poder entender cómo es el camino del riesgo, ¿no? Entonces, este es nuestro museo y está rodeado por esta avenida, esta es una avenida, estas son calles, una escuela y 2 edificios privados. Y enfrente, por supuesto, el parque, como les comentaba. Entonces, esto nos da un panorama de cómo podemos actuar si tenemos una situación de emergencia en la institución. Estas son las 2 entradas. Este es el plano de planta baja, la entrada principal por la calle Cuba, y una entrada auxiliar, o que se utiliza cuando el museo está cerrado, del lado de Juramento. O sea, esta es Cuba y esta es Juramento, ¿no? Estas son la identificación de nuestras entradas. Esta es la entrada principal, por el lado de la calle Cuba, donde se ingresa a las salas de exhibición de este museo. Y de la misma manera que de Pachi estuvo hablando sobre la importancia de entender el valor de las colecciones, hemos trabajado sobre cuál es el valor que nosotros le damos a las colecciones. Ahora, como ella decía, esto va cambiando y va a depender de un montón de cosas, aspectos históricos, aspectos políticos, la administración en ese momento de la institución. En este caso la administro yo y tengo determinados valores o priorizo determinadas cosas en relación con el guión curatorial que tenga la institución, en relación con la conservación de las piezas que sean parte de esto. Entonces, esa conjunción y ese logaritmo que uno arma termina por dar estos resultados, ¿no? Para nosotros, hoy, este es nuestro país, ¿no?, de valoración. Siguiendo con la misma línea de la cual hablaba de Pachi, estamos ubicando en planta baja todas las colecciones y el valor de esas colecciones y los porcentajes para tener en cuenta por dónde avanzar si tenemos esta emergencia, ¿no? Esto es, como les estaba comentando planta baja, y aquí otra vez la planta baja. Bueno, tengo dos planos. La idea es poder mostrarles cuáles son las salas de exhibición. En esta planta baja solamente tenemos una reserva aquí. Todo el resto, como ven acá, son salas de exhibición. En el caso de la planta alta, tenemos estas reservas, como ven acá. Esto da sobre la calle Juramento, y esto es el contrafrente del edificio. La biblioteca, la reserva de biblioteca y el archivo. Así que para nosotros esto es lo más peligroso y lo que más rápidamente va a ser afectado si hay una situación de fuego. Otra manera de poder ver nuestras reservas, estas son reservas, esta es la sala de lectura, no es una reserva de la biblioteca, ¿no? Bien, y como estaba contando, tanto de Pachi, bueno, en este caso esto lo contaba Ripoll, qué sucede y qué relaciones hay con mis capacidades, las vulnerabilidades y qué exposición tengo, ¿no? Entonces, lo que se hace frente a esto es, digamos, una conjunción de cuáles son mis capacidades y vulnerabilidades y qué exposición tengo frente a esto para poder saber cuál va a ser el impacto y a partir de eso, si voy a tener o no una pérdida y cuál, digamos, va a ser el deterioro de esas colecciones. Entonces, específicamente en nuestro caso, en el caso del museo, respecto de nuestras capacidades, nosotros estamos a 10 centímetros de lo que es el área problemática en relación con, no sé si saben mucho, pero Belgrano generalmente es una zona muy baja, entonces es propensa a inundarse, pero el edificio está elevado unos 10 centímetros. Entonces, eso nos da la capacidad de, digamos, de poder reaccionar mucho más rápidamente. Y por otro lado, estamos, por supuesto que se ha hecho siempre, ¿no? Pero específicamente luego de hacer esta capacitación con ICCROM y College Team, focalizamos nuestro trabajo en la capacitación del grupo y la gente que trabaja en el museo, no solo los empleados que son parte del Ministerio de Cultura de la Nación, sino también la gente de seguridad y limpieza, para que puedan accionar frente a una situación compleja y evitar, digamos, un desastre, ¿no? Respecto de cuáles son cuán expuestos estamos a situaciones, en este caso de inundación, nosotros hemos evaluado dos situaciones de peligro en el museo, por un lado la situación de inundación, y por otro lado la situación de incendio. Nosotros sufrimos en el museo un incendio en el año 2018, en enero del 2018, yo todavía no estaba en la administración del museo, pero la pérdida, o sea, no se perdieron colecciones realmente, porque el incendio fue, si bien fue en el predio del museo, se circunscribió solamente al bar que estaba allí, se prendió fuego la grasa que estaba en la campana, y esto generó, bueno, que se incendiara todo este bar, restaurante. Eso prendió las alertas para el museo y empezamos a trabajar en tratar de mejorar situaciones que podrían despertar o generar algún incendio. Como estaba hablando Ripoll en su exposición, pensemos lo que sucedió en el Museo de Brasil o en India, ¿no? Específicamente con estos temas de peligro de fuego que uno a veces no repara en determinadas situaciones eléctricas con las que convive cotidianamente, y que a veces simplemente con guardar un cable dentro de un cable canal, o digamos que no siga expuesto, esto disminuye bastante este peligro de incendio. Entonces, ¿cuáles son específicamente nuestras exposiciones en este sentido, ¿no? En el caso de los problemas eléctricos, el museo no cuenta con aire acondicionado, así que es un edificio muy frío, y por lo que la gente generalmente enciende las estufas de manera muy cercana a ellos, donde están las computadoras, los cables y demás, pero tenemos problemas con la capacidad de la red eléctrica, que no es muy amplia, y al enchufar las estufas y demás, hemos tenido problemas con se prenden fuego los enchufes, o se derriten, o se cortan, saltan las térmicas, determinadas situaciones que estamos en este momento tratando de solucionar. Y por supuesto, algo que hemos detectado es que las rondas nocturnas del servicio de seguridad no se estaban realizando. Eso para nosotros es muy importante porque si alguien se olvida encendida, por ejemplo, la estufa, o peligros de incendio con los dispensers de agua son muy comunes. Entonces, bueno, esa es una de las, digamos, de las exposiciones que sabemos que podemos evitar, ¿no? Y como vieron debajo, tenemos, nuestra colección es en un gran porcentaje papel, textil, madera, por tanto, digamos, la vulnerabilidad de nuestras colecciones es muy alta. La falta de mantenimiento de esta red eléctrica, como les decía, y luego de la pandemia, si bien estamos volviendo lentamente a trabajar en las oficinas, no está el equipo completo. Y al no estar el equipo completo, no hemos podido realizar un simulacro como corresponde con todo el personal. Entonces, esa falta de personal y de conexión entre nosotros puede generar un problema, ¿no? La falta de comunicación. ¿Cuál sería entonces el impacto, ¿no? de esta conjunción de vulnerabilidades, exposiciones y, por supuesto, restando, ¿no? a estas dos problemáticas las capacidades que tenemos? Es que principalmente consideramos que frente a un incendio lo que más rápido se va a ver afectado son nuestros libros, nuestras bibliotecas y todos los muebles de madera. Entonces, digo, estas ecuaciones que se han hecho y que hemos hecho, como considerar el valor, como ver cuáles son las vulnerabilidades y las exposiciones a las que se someten las colecciones, y frente a esto las capacidades que tenemos, podemos entender qué es lo que deberíamos mejorar para que el peligro sea menor, ¿no? La probabilidad de emergencia o desastre sea mejor. Y en eso estamos trabajando ahora. Estamos trabajando en nuestras vulnerabilidades y en el nivel de exposición que tenemos. Y respecto de esta presentación, la voy a llevar adelante mañana, que es justamente cuando se hable específicamente de los escenarios en los que estuvimos trabajando y las problemáticas que van a haber en otras instituciones, tanto de Brasil como de Argentina. Ahora había varias preguntas, no sé si Ana Carolina, Alesia, quieren estar presentes para responder las preguntas o para ayudarme.
Sí, claro. Aquí tengo algunas ya compiladas. Julieta Cabriera de México no, está aquí participando y nos dice, creo que con relación a participaciones de PACSI, creo que la parte más compleja dentro de la gestión de riesgos es darle un valor o porcentaje de valor a las colecciones, ya que esta visión debe contener las opiniones de todos los distintos actores dentro del museo. No sé si quieren complementar, discutir.
Sí, mira, hola Julieta, ¿cómo te va? Julieta ha sido compañera mía en México cuando estudié allí, así que, hola Juli, ¿cómo te va? Sí, lamentablemente al ser un seminario tan corto, no pudimos mostrar, digamos, todas las variables que uno debe considerar. Estás absolutamente de acuerdo, y en este caso los actores no solo del museo, internos, sino también externos, necesitamos entender qué le importa a la comunidad, qué pasa ¿no? dentro de la institución, por supuesto. Igual el tercer día, Enrique va a hablar sobre específicamente la relación con los stakeholders. Así que sí, por supuesto que tenés razón. Lamento que en 15 minutos uno no pueda hablar todo esto, pero presten atención porque, digo, todo el tiempo hay capacitaciones del ICCROM específicamente sobre estos temas que podemos ir viendo, digo, para poder ampliar, pero absolutamente de acuerdo con lo que estás diciendo, Juli. No sé si sirvió lo que dije, no sé si de Pachi quiere contestar. Ok, o no sé. Bueno,
vamos para la próxima.
con otra.
Sí.
Dale.
Ortigosa Walter dice que él era estudiante y que estaba en esta ocasión de enchente en La Plata, en Buenos Aires, que vio la destrucción de la biblioteca que aconteció también en Monasterio San José y que estaba entonces describiendo su experiencia a 8 años atrás. Entonces, creo que fue una experiencia muy personal, ¿no?
Sí, sí, sí.
Hay una pregunta de Claudia Barra. ¿Existe una recomendación sobre dejar funcionando o no los deshumedecedores cuando no estamos en la institución?
Bien, no sé si alguien quiere contestar, Alesia, Ripoll. Yo puedo ir... Alesia, sí, adelante.
No, you go first, you go first.
Perfecto. Claudia, lo que considero es que sí hay que dejarlos encendidos. Por ejemplo, en el caso de Buenos Aires nosotros tenemos una humedad muy alta. Si nosotros encendemos y apagamos estos aparatos todo el tiempo, lo que vamos a generar son picos de subida de humedad y bajada de humedad, y esto genera en los materiales que son mucho más sensibles, el papel, la madera y demás, un proceso que se conoce como histéresis. Todos los elementos que son higroscópicos, como el papel, la madera, ¿no? El textil, todo lo que sean orgánicos, absorben y liberan humedad del ambiente conforme tratan de adaptarse a la situación que las rodea. Si yo estoy todo el tiempo subiendo la humedad y bajando la humedad, ese material lo que va a hacer es absorber y liberar humedad al ambiente todo el tiempo hasta llegar a un momento que entra en colapso, ¿no? Esta histéresis de la que hablaba. Este colapso va a hacer que el material se rompa, se alveolee, se abarquille, bueno, generen un montón de situaciones. Por eso es importante mantener la temperatura y la humedad, las dos cosas, porque siempre van juntas, lo más estable posible. En Buenos Aires, como sabemos que tenemos problemas energéticos, un aire acondicionado por ahí es más problemático. En cambio, un deshumidificador nos permite controlar moderadamente el ambiente, y si es que en algún momento se corta la luz, no es tan crítico como un aire acondicionado. Pero lo recomendable es siempre tenerlo encendido, porque además tienen un humidistato, o sea que cuando no tiene que sacar más humedad del ambiente, se detiene. No sé si contesté tu pregunta, no sé si alguien más, Ana o Alesia, quieren agregar.
Quería solamente complementar, está perfecto todo lo que dices, Virginia, pero es importante tener en cuenta que cómo van a ser equipos que están funcionando 24/7 en nuestros museos, que tenemos que prever un mantenimiento regular para ellos, ¿no? Y son equipos muchas veces robustos que tienen motores y ventiladores, entonces debemos tener, por lo menos en mi museo hacemos un mantenimiento anual. Una vez por año enviamos los equipos para las empresas que hacen la limpieza, verificación de los motores y todo, para que podamos así reducir las posibilidades de problemas, ¿no?
Sí, contesto nuevamente a Claudia porque ella habla específicamente del incendio. Bueno, en ese caso lo que tenés que mejorar es la red eléctrica y tener cuidado, ¿no? de que no se sobrecargue la línea. Para eso, digo, que hagan un análisis algún técnico eléctrico y vaya a la institución para decirte si realmente tu red soporta eso. Con eso tendrías que estar cubierta, pero igualmente es preferible no desenchufarlo, ¿no? Mientras vos puedas hacer las adecuaciones eléctricas, no necesitarías desenchufarlo, perdón. Después había otra pregunta, ¿no?
Sí, hay. Déjame ver aquí. De Anaí Kufner, para Virginia y de Pachi. ¿Qué sistema contra incendios tienen en las instituciones respectivas, teniendo en cuenta que un museo o biblioteca se puede dañar el material con los químicos?
No sé si de Pachi sigue con nosotros o se fue, porque como tenía mala conexión.
No, aún está.
De Pachi, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I'm here. Virginia, you want to go ahead?
Ok, perfecto. En el caso del Museo Sarmiento, nosotros contamos con extintores de humo. El problema es que el museo no tiene extintores de halon, que sería lo mejor porque no deteriora el material, sino que tiene de los ABC. No son los mejores, estamos intentando cambiarlos, pero bueno, eso es un costo para el Ministerio de Cultura alto y no están de acuerdo por este momento en cambiarlo, pero estamos pujando para que eso suceda. Tenemos muy en cuenta que no es el mejor método el que tenemos y que eso genera abrasión y deterioro, ¿no? Y hidrolización en el material, por eso estamos trabajando sobre eso. No tenemos sprinklers y en muchas instituciones lo que se hace es generar vacíos en las áreas, ¿no? Y aislar, digamos, si nosotros, por ejemplo, en el caso del Museo Sarmiento, tenemos el deshumidificador en el área de biblioteca que tiene un piso de madera y está aislado con por una plancha de Durlock. Si se incendiara ese aparato, no se esparciría el fuego en toda la biblioteca, quedaría allí. Digo, son pequeñas, a veces, como les decía antes, pequeñas acciones, aunque no tengamos tanto presupuesto, que pueden servir para mitigar. No sé si querés continuar, de Pachi.
Okay. So if I take my example, before joining this ICCROM Fire Croatia course, we had only a couple of fire extinguishers, as mentioned by Virginia, by smoke, which we had in indoor gallery and in archive. But you know, after attending this, somehow we got an insight of how to go about it. So we are in a process of getting fire hydrant in the outdoor collection, and like Virginia just said, that we also don't have sprinklers, but recently, because a part of the ICCROM Fire Croatia course, we had this project wherein there was never a fire people coming into our museum, so we managed to get them on board, and they have suggested few things to be added into our museum, and we would be having a fire audit soon. So if anything adds on to it, I'll definitely share it with Virginia, and maybe she can share it with you all. Thank you.
Perfecto. Después, Geraldine pregunta, hola Geraldine, ¿cómo te va? Pregunta por las rondas y los controles. Bueno, como nosotros teníamos problemas con las rondas y los controles, bueno, por el curso que hicimos en ICCROM, hemos conseguido un subsidio que invertimos en el museo, y ese dinero, entre otras cosas que hicimos, ¿no? Como mejorar la red eléctrica, compramos lo que se llama un controlador de rondines, que es simplemente un lápiz que el jefe del guardia de seguridad va a ir apoyando en determinados puntos de la institución que se le colocan, y eso genera un tiempo. Y ese tiempo, digamos, nosotros establecimos los rondines cada 2 horas. Entonces ellos deben pasar por determinados puntos cada 2 horas, ¿no? Cliqueando en todos esos puntos, y eso a nosotros nos tira una base de datos. De alguna manera es una situación persuasiva, ¿no? Para que puedan continuar con los controles digamos, de todos los espacios, verificar que todo esté desenchufado, que todo esté acorde a como hemos planteado en las diferentes capacitaciones, y eso es lo que, bueno, de alguna manera reduce la posibilidad de alguna de estas emergencias. No sé si con eso contesté, Geraldine.
Sí, yo lo que decía en cuanto a seguridad era el hecho de que tener los deshumidificadores prendidos todo el tiempo con una ronda de seguridad, eso se puede prever si hay algún problema o un principio de incendio, etc. Gracias.
Absolutamente.
Pero además
sí,
me interesó esto de los rondines. Me pareció súper interesante, gracias.
No había entendido la pregunta, entonces, buenísimo. Sí, totalmente de acuerdo, Geraldine.
Y tengo aquí una más de Claudia Barra. ¿Cuál sería el mejor tipo de extintor para las reservas técnicas de pintura?
Pues generalmente son los de halon, los extintores de halon. Ahora te lo anoto aquí, en el chat. Esos son los mejores, pero son los más caros del mercado. Generalmente los museos estos no los tienen, hay que pedirlos específicamente y triplican el valor de los extintores.
Hay otra más de Carolina
Sí,
Cortés. Ella agradece, no puede ver la primera presentación. Tengo una duda sobre la formulación del plan de riesgos de desastres. En este documento se incluyen las gestiones y trabajos destinados a la conservación preventiva o solo aquellos eventos que sobrepasan las capacidades de la institución.
Bueno, tal vez Alesia, que estuviste presentando esa parte, ¿querés contestarlo?
Yes, I hope I understood right. So the question is if we take into account in the disaster risk management plan also the preventive conservation. Is this the question? Yeah, I would know, because preventive conservation is more you know, let's just make an example. If we have the sun coming from the window and we can cover it with a textile or something, then this what is this risk of fading our objects? It's we have contained. So this is when we talk about the preventing conservation, are those elements that we want to work as our institution, as our cultural heritage, would last longer. So, and then is the humidity, temperature, and this kind of, as we said, the 10 agents of deterioration. While when we talk about disaster risk management or emergency plan, okay, or if it's just for an institution, those elements are the one that just happen suddenly, okay? So if you have a water leakage or there is a heavy rain, for example, there's a heavy rain and the water coming from your from the roof. So you need to have it clear how to act in this kind of situation. So your director should know to whom call, who the person that are there can just to evacuate or move the object that are direct under the water. So those are kind of things that are not, I would definitely say to separate and to work differently, because how you prepare, it's completely different. You're not going to make drills on how to close or how to prevent the sun coming from the window. Once it's done, it's done. While you need to train in order to respond for heavy rain, or for a fire that is causing, or from a flood, for example, that is going to enter, or any kind of emergency / disaster that can occur. Is it clear?
Yes, perfect. Y por otro lado, lo que sucede muchas veces es que los, digamos, los planes de emergencia se tienden a tornar demasiado grandes y tumultuosos, con muchas páginas que la gente no lee. Y algo muy importante es que la gente entienda y pueda leer estos planes y que sean fáciles de leer. Entonces, complejizarlos a veces genera que, digamos, le quita ganas a la gente de leerlo, ¿no? Entonces, lo que hay que tratar es que todo el personal conozca plenamente el plan de emergencias. Entonces, para eso hay que focalizarse, ¿no? Estos son los puntos que vamos a atacar, esto es en lo que hay que mejorar, esto es lo que hay que hacer.
If I may add
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just to add something, you know, for example, the humidity. If you have high humidity, it's not that it's going to affect direct and suddenly the object. For the long run, it means that you have time to just, and once you solve the problem, you have solved it, I would say. While these emergency disasters are something that it's like that are just coming, and you should just be prepared to respond to those. And through the scenario and working with understanding the risk path, your values, you try to reduce the impact. But it's really important to know that every time that you prepare, as Paul was saying, every time you prepare for something, then there is something else. In the disaster professional field, say that you can prepare until you can always prepare, but disaster is going to challenge you all the time. So every time there's going to be something more. For example, you know, in 2019, we were doing course on disasters, you know, I think we have covered all of kind of possibilities. And then suddenly the pandemic, who could thought about pandemic, you know? So disaster is also really a different approach, you know, that you need to be aware that you're going to prepare, but there's going to be something that is going to challenge. You know, you cannot be prepared 100%. Your aim is to prepare yourself, so to reduce the time to response, you know, and when you reduce the time, you reduce also, because your aim is to increase the capacity and you reduce the damages. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Ana.
No, era solamente para complementar lo que dice César Abatidaga. Lo sencillo promete éxito. Exactamente eso, ¿no, Virginia? Un plan de emergencia muy complexo y que si simplemente se inscribe y se guarda, no sirve de mucho, ¿no? Hay aquí una pregunta de Isamara que está aquí en portugués. Pregunta para Virginia. La divulgación de la planta baja con localización de objetos y su valor no podría ser un factor de riesgo para furtos, robos. Entendemos que la planta sea fundamental para el plan de gestión de riesgos, pero pienso que hay esta otra cuestión también, ¿no? En la Biblioteca Nacional de Río de Janeiro, donde Isamara trabaja, esta es una preocupación y por eso los funcionarios no tienen acceso a esta planta.
Bien, en el caso de... Ella está hablando específicamente de los empleados, ¿verdad? ¿No?
Sí, creo que sí, sí.
Sí, es cierto que hay posibilidades de que haya robos. Igual nuestra planta, yo estoy muy... perfecto. Muy de acuerdo en poder compartir con el staff del museo las capacidades que tiene la institución y cuáles son sus colecciones y cuál es el valor de esas colecciones. De hecho, hemos hecho específicamente, y esto asesorado por Alesia y por Aparna, cuáles son específicamente esos objetos que necesitamos que sean salvados en el caso de una emergencia. Pero bueno, tenemos, tenemos el grupo de seguridad, tenemos circuito cerrado de cámaras de control, existen controles, nosotros esperamos que esto no suceda, es posible que suceda, es una posibilidad, pero la reducción de esas posibilidades está en el control que hacemos constantemente. Igualmente, creo que el entender cuál es el valor de esas colecciones es fundamental, ¿no? Que el personal sepa cuál es el valor de esas colecciones es fundamental porque están trabajando allí. El desconocimiento genera peligro, eso es así. Pero bueno, es una opinión personal, ¿no? Sí, Ale.
Yeah, I think the question, I agree what you were saying, Virginia. I was just to add that the question is really at the point. It's really true that once we get in detail and we make the priority list, okay, if something happened, we need to save this, this, and this, because it's are the objects that have the most value. Of course, this is a document that is going to be used also from some stealer, as you know, it's like a map where you say, oh, these are the pieces that we should take, you know, and just give help. This is why you can be generic, and then you can have a piece that is separate and say, okay, those are the ones that are really the most important one. And those are the one the director knows or the visual director knows. So then it's also a matter of you, the organization, because this is really important. The disaster risk management plan or planning, I would say, is really tailored to your institution. Because we can make it general. We have said what is important inside, which is the structure. We use the structure that is already there in order to help you. But also it's really tailored. We cannot give you advice on, because if we think to a museum with 10 people or a museum with 200 people, of course it's going to change a lot.
Perfect, yes. Bueno, no sé si algún comentario más, Ana.
No, de verdad, Isamara me dice que está de acuerdo, pero no, ellos ahí no tienen este acceso. Y bien, no sé
Bueno, eso,
si
¿qué
Isamara
tiene
quiere complementar, pero
sí.
también me pongo de acuerdo con Alessia y Virginia que el desconocimiento trae más riesgo, no lo que otras cosas también, ¿no? Hay aquí otro comentario que llega ahora de Carol Vitagliano. Particularmente la forma de cuidar de los objetos también es una exhaustiva documentación. Y él, me parece que no terminó. Nos quedamos en suspense. César ofrece otra contribución.
Ana,
ahí abajo,
debajo,
¿no?
Sí.
Está bien. Y contar con Interpol. Sí, fundamental eso, ¿no? Tener los registros, las fotos de los objetos, tener toda la documentación es una prueba de que podemos decir, mira, eso es nuestro, ¿no? De nuestro museo. Tener eso siempre actualizado es también una acción que podemos hacer para prevenir.
Bueno, hay un caso muy particular. El Museo Histórico Nacional de Argentina, determinados empleados hicieron un robo de unas monedas del patrimonio cultural del museo, y gracias a que estaban identificadas, fotografiadas, etcétera, etcétera, cuando entraron en el mercado negro, se identificaron rápidamente y volvieron al museo. Esas personas ya están procesadas y demás, ¿no? Pero, digo, puede suceder, no es que no estamos negando esta situación, puede suceder. Pero bueno, como dicen tanto Ana como Alessia, el desconocimiento genera más problemas que el poder difundir el patrimonio, así que yo brego por eso.
Sí, hoy mismo abrí las redes sociales y había un perfil de Perú, de un amigo que imparte cursos también de gestión de riesgos y catalogación de colecciones y todo. Él siempre difunde piezas que fueron robadas. Entonces, había una publicación así, esta pieza fue robada del Museo X en 2018, aún buscamos por esa pieza, ¿no? Y la información ya tenía más de 100 compartimientos y se difunde rápido, y ese es justamente, cuanto más las personas vean, cuanto más podamos firmar y decir, mira, eso era nuestro y se fue, más también restringimos el acceso para que el robo, el comercio continúe difundiendo, ¿no? Hay aquí una pregunta, un comentario de César. Todo se resume en una adecuada y profesional gestión de riesgos. Uno de los desafíos más importantes es hacer que los que realmente saben de eso sean tenidos en cuenta. Hay que hacer justamente una gestión integral de riesgos. Sí, sin duda.
Perfecto. No sé si les parece, vamos a ir cerrando ya porque es un poco tarde. Les recuerdo, ya han preguntado varias personas, tanto ASINPPAC como PACHAMAMA, luego de terminadas las jornadas, poco a poco iremos compartiendo en nuestras redes y en nuestros canales las grabaciones, así que no se preocupen. Quienes han asistido, les pedimos por favor que nos envíen, porque bueno, si bien hubo muchas personas inscriptas, siempre hay alguna deserción, les pedimos por favor que nos manden un mail tanto a Pachamama como a ASINPPAC para empezar a confeccionar de aquí a una semana, téngannos paciencia, los certificados. Así que van a tener los certificados, pero les pedimos que nos envíen el mail para confirmar sus nombres y su participación. Bueno, no sé si alguna cosa más. Nos vemos mañana a las 9 de la mañana, hora Argentina, Brasil. Les agradecemos enormemente su participación, su paciencia y que sepan entender los problemas técnicos que podemos tener. Bueno, son cosas que nos exceden.
Mañana es el mismo link. Muchas personas están aquí preguntando eso, muchos no recibieron, otros emails fueron para spam y no importa. Mañana es el mismo link y nos vemos a la misma hora.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias a las intérpretes que han estado trabajando detrás de todo esto. El esfuerzo es grandísimo, así que sí, chicas, muchísimas gracias por su ayuda y nos estamos viendo mañana. Les mandamos un abrazo.